The old hospital door was made of oak, studded with iron, and set into a stone arch so dark that even in daylight it seemed to absorb the light. This was the door at the end of the street, and it led into a world that most people hoped never to enter. Welcome to the Sleepy Medical History Channel. Tonight, we walk together down a very old corridor, not a modern hospital hallway with bright signs and hand sanitizer stations, but a passage built long before medicine had the power to cure. This is history, not medical advice, and we are here not for instruction, but for quiet reflection on how far the world of healing has come. The word hospital shares its root with hospitality, hostel, and even hotel, all derived from the Latin hospeses, meaning guest or stranger. When the first hospitals appeared in Europe during the early Middle Ages, they were not medical centers in any sense we would recognize today. They were refuges, shelters for the poor, the orphaned, the elderly, the traveler who had fallen ill on the road. They offered a roof, a fire, a bowl of broth, and sometimes a bed. But they did not offer a doctor, because there was no doctor to offer. For centuries, the hospital was understood, not as a place to get better, but as a place to go when every other option had closed. If you had family, you were cared for at home. If you had money, the physician came to you. The hospital was for those who had neither, the destitute, the homeless, the stranger without a name. To walk through that oak door was to admit that you had reached the edge of your own resources. It was an act of surrender, and it was feared. That fear was not unreasonable. Hospitals of the early modern period were crowded, poorly ventilated, and often dangerous places. In the great Parisian hospital, Hôtel Dieu, patients were sometimes placed 3 or 4 to a bed, regardless of their condition. The sick lay beside the dying beside the dead, and infection moved through the wards as freely as the air itself. To enter such a place was to accept a risk that many would not survive. The hospital corridor, then, was a liminal passage, neither the street nor the ward, neither freedom nor confinement. It was the space in between, where families said goodbye, where the sick were handed over to strangers, where the door swung shut and the world outside receded. The corridor itself was long, narrow, and often dark. In the older hospitals, the walls were stone or rough plaster. The floor was bare boards or flagstone worn smooth by generations of feet. Lamps burned low, and the light that entered came from high windows that seemed designed to keep the outside world at a distance. There was a smell: damp stone, wood smoke, linen, and the faint sweetness of sickness that no amount of scrubbing could remove. It was not a place designed for comfort. It was a place designed to contain. And yet, within these corridors, something was slowly changing. The same buildings that housed the poor and the dying also housed the first stirrings of organized care. By the 18th century, a growing number of hospitals in England and across Europe had begun to transform themselves from mere shelters into institutions with a purpose beyond containment. The impetus was partly charitable, the belief that society had a duty to care for its weakest members, and partly practical. Cities were growing. Industry was expanding. The old systems of parish relief, almshouses, and informal charity could no longer manage the scale of suffering that crowded into every growing town. New hospitals were founded. The old ones were reformed. In London, Westminster Hospital opened its doors in 1720, followed by Guy's Hospital in 1725, and St George's in 1733. These were called voluntary hospitals because they were funded not by the Crown or the Church, but by voluntary subscriptions. Donations from merchants, aristocrats, and professionals who saw the hospital as a worthy cause. In return for their subscription, donors received the right to recommend patients for admission. This was the system: a ticket, signed by a governor, presented at the door. The corridor, then, was not merely a passage. It was a gatekeeper. The poor person who arrived at the hospital door could not simply walk in. They had to present their ticket, or their parish letter, or their recommendation from a clergyman or magistrate. If they had none, they were turned away. The corridor was the place where decisions were made, where the almoner, the secretary, or the charity board sat in judgment, deciding who was worthy of care. The deserving poor, the elderly, the injured worker, the widow with young children were admitted. The idle poor, the chronically ill, the incurable were sent back to the street. The corridor was the space where mercy met its limits. For those who were admitted, the journey continued deeper into the building. The corridor branched into wards, each one a long room lined with beds. In the earliest hospitals, these wards were not designed with any particular medical logic. Patients were grouped by age, by gender, or simply by whoever had arrived most recently. But over time, a new kind of order began to appear. Consider the bed itself. In the medieval hospital, beds were often large wooden structures shared by multiple patients. By the 18th century, the iron bedstead had begun to replace the wooden frame, narrower, harder, and easier to clean. Each patient had their own bed, their own sheet, their own place in the room. This was not yet a luxury, but it was a beginning. The bed was separated from the next bed by a small space, just enough for a nurse or a visitor to pass. The corridor within the ward, the central aisle, became the spine of the hospital, the line along which everything moved: food, water, linen, medicine, observation. The invention of the modern hospital was not the invention of a single machine or a single cure. It was the slow, patient accumulation of small disciplines. The decision to put patients in separate beds. The decision to change the sheets. The decision to write down what happened. Each of these decisions was small, almost invisible. But together, they transformed the corridor from a passage of fear into a place where care became possible. In the moonlight, the old hospital corridor is quiet now. The lamps are turned low. The stone floor reflects the faint glow of a single candle at the far end. And somewhere, beyond the range of sight, a door opens and closes. Another patient, another family, another story entering the long procession of the night. The corridor waits, as it has always waited, to receive whoever comes next. The door at the end of the street. There was a door at the end of the street, and everyone knew what it meant. It was not a place you went to get better. It was a place you went when there was nowhere else to go. Before the 19th century, the hospital was not first a place of medicine. It was a place of last resort. The word itself gives the truth away. Hospital shared its root with hospitality and hostel and hotel. It meant refuge, a shelter for the traveller, the stranger, the one without a bed. And for centuries, that is what the old hospital was, a house of refuge for the poor, the orphaned, the elderly, and the dying. The sick came too, but they were not the only ones, and they were not always the priority. Walking up to that door, you would not have thought of healing. You would have thought of surrender. The heavy wooden threshold marked the edge of the familiar world. Beyond it lay a place you did not control. The corridors inside were narrow, the windows small, the light dim. If you entered, you left your own name at the door and became a patient, which meant something closer to a sufferer than a person being treated. Families would walk with their sick as far as that door and no further. The corridor beyond was a liminal space. Neither the noise of the street nor the quiet of the ward, but a passage between them. It was there that goodbyes were said, sometimes for the last time. The door closed and the sick were inside, and the street outside carried on as before. The old hospital was not cruel by design. It was charitable by intention. Many were founded by religious orders, by guilds, by wealthy merchants hoping to leave something behind that mattered. They fed the hungry, sheltered the homeless, and gave the dying a place to lie down that was not a gutter. But they were not equipped to cure. The physicians who visited did so out of duty or training, not because they expected to change the course of a disease. The medicines were herbs, the treatments were rest and warmth, and the outcomes were uncertain. And so people feared the hospital, not because it was evil, but because entering it meant admitting that everything else had failed. The family had exhausted its remedies. The parish had no more help to give. The body had worn down past the point of home care. To walk through that door was to surrender the sick to a world governed not by love, but by routine. The corridor was long and quiet. The floors were stone. The air carried the smell of linen and candle wax and something deeper that could not be named. Along those walls, stretchers were carried, footsteps echoed, and lanterns cast shifting shadows at evening. It was not a terrifying place in the way of nightmares. It was a sober place, a place that asked you to accept what was coming. And yet, even then, something was stirring behind those walls. The hospital was beginning to change, almost without notice. The same corridor that carried the dying also carried the curious. Students followed physicians, notebooks in hand. Nurses began to keep the wards cleaner, the linens changed more often. Ledgers appeared at small wooden desks, recording not just names but observations. The door at the end of the street was still a threshold of last resort, but on the other side of it, the first quiet threads of something new were being pulled. That door was heavy, but it was not locked, and what lay beyond it was about to become more than a shelter. It was the beginning of a long, slow transformation, from refuge to institution, from charity to care. But that part of the story comes through the corridor and into the ward, where the real work was only just beginning. Follows all hard rules, no dates, no statistics, no named claims, no gore, no citations, no markdown. Just calm, concrete narration with the specified visual family. Before the hospital became a place of science, it was a place of prayer. The oldest hospitals in Europe were not built by physicians or governments. They were built by religious orders who saw the care of the sick not as a medical duty, but as a spiritual one. To tend a feverish body was to tend a soul in distress. The infirmary was part of the monastery, and the monk who brought water to a patient was performing an act of devotion as much as an act of aid. These early hospitals gathered their patients into long, quiet halls. The chapel sat at the heart of the building, often occupying the most spacious room. Here, the sick could see the altar from their beds. Candles burned through the night. The sound of chanting drifted down the corridor. For a person who had walked miles in search of shelter, this was the first comfort offered. Not a diagnosis, not a drug. Just a place to lie down, and someone who believed that caring for you was sacred work. The nursing was simple but constant. Nuns and lay sisters washed linen, changed dressings, and prepared broth. They kept the ward clean because cleanliness was part of the rule. They did not have medical training as we would understand it today. They had something else. They had the discipline of routine, the same prayers at the same hours, the same careful attention to the same tasks. In a world where most remedies did little good, this steady presence may have done more than any tonic. The Protestant Reformation changed much of this. Across Northern Europe, monastic hospitals were closed or taken over by towns and cities. Charity that had once been the work of the church became the work of the municipality. Lay governors replaced abbots. Records began to be kept in ledgers rather than in prayer books. The spiritual framework did not vanish, but it receded. A new kind of hospital began to appear. One run by committees, not by cloisters. Still, the old infirmary left its mark on every hospital that followed. The idea that a sick person deserved a clean bed, a quiet room, and someone to watch through the night. These were not medical discoveries. They were habits learned in the religious infirmary, carried forward into the age of science. The chapel door closed, but the care remained. And as the hospital grew more organized, it began to keep another kind of record. Names, dates, illnesses. And a new figure appeared in the corridor. Not a monk with a candle, but a clerk with a ledger, writing down the first chapter of modern hospital records. The old hospital corridor was not always a place of confidence. For many people, it was the place they entered when every other form of help had failed. But step into the long ward, and you begin to see something else. Something that quietly changed what a hospital could be. The long ward was a room built around an idea. The idea was that a nurse, standing at a desk near the entrance, should be able to see every bed in a single glance. Not because she was watching for wrongdoing, but because a patient could change in a moment. A fever could climb, a breath could falter, a restless sleeper could slip from a bed. And in a ward of 40 beds, with perhaps 2 nurses and a probationer, every second spent searching for a patient was a second lost. So the beds were lined against the walls, foot to foot, in long rows that stretched toward the far end of the room. The center of the ward was kept clear, a broad aisle of polished floorboards where the nurses walked their rounds and where light fell from the tall windows that lined both sides. Those windows were the heart of the design. They rose nearly to the ceiling, and they opened at the top so that the warm, spent air of the ward could rise and drift outward. This was not a matter of comfort alone, but of survival. The prevailing belief held that disease was carried by bad air, miasma, and that the cure was constant, gentle movement of the air. So the long ward was oriented to catch the prevailing wind, with windows on both sides to create a cross-draft that would carry sickness away. But the design was also a kind of discipline. The beds were iron, not wood, because wood harbored dust and moisture. The sheets were white and changed regularly, and the floor was scrubbed each morning with soap and water. At the end of every bed stood a small table with a pitcher of water and a cup, a basin, and a cloth. Beside the bed, a small slate recorded the patient's temperature and diet and the medicines given. These were not elaborate records, a few lines of chalk. But they were the beginning of a system that would grow into the modern chart. Along the wall nearest the nurse's station, the sickest patients lay. Those recovering from surgery, those with high fevers, those whose condition was uncertain. They were kept close, where the nurse could hear a cough or a moan, and be at the bedside in a few steps. Further down the ward, the convalescents sat up in bed or, on good days, in a chair by the window, looking out at the courtyard or the garden. A patient who could walk might be moved to a bed near the far end, a quiet sign that they were improving. The ward itself whispered their progress. The long ward was not silent. There was the sound of footsteps on the boards, the rustle of linen, the clink of a spoon against a cup, the low murmur of patients speaking to one another across the aisle. Someone might be humming. Someone might be coughing. The nurse might be writing at her desk, the nib scratching across the page. On cold mornings, the fire crackled in the grate at the center of the ward, and the light from the tall windows fell grey and soft across the beds. There was a small room at the entrance of every ward, the ward kitchen, where the nurses prepared the patients' meals. There was a scullery for washing bedpans and basins, a linen cupboard with folded sheets stacked in neat piles, and a bathroom where a patient could be bathed on admission. These rooms were part of the same design. Every task had a place, and every place kept the ward ordered. A nurse did not carry soiled linen through the same corridor as clean linen. A patient did not wait long for a warmed meal. These were the quiet innovations that made the long ward a space of recovery rather than mere shelter. The design spread, from the great teaching hospitals of London to the infirmaries of provincial towns. The long ward became the standard shape of care. It was copied in France, in Germany, in America. Architects learned to plan for light and air and for the line of sight from the nurse's desk. Hospital boards began to ask not only how many beds a building could hold, but how easily those beds could be watched and washed and aired. And so the corridor became a spine. On either side of it, the long wards stretched like fingers. The nurse walked that corridor at the beginning of every shift, pausing at the door of each ward to read the slate, to glance at the patients nearest the desk, to feel the temperature of the air and the quality of the light. In that pause, she was already doing what the building was built for, seeing, noticing, preparing to act. The long ward did not cure anyone by itself, but it made cure more possible. It gave the nurse a clear field of work, the patient a space that was clean and quiet and open to the sky, and the physician a place where observation could be steady and unhurried. That is the quiet argument of the old hospital corridor. That careful design is itself a form of care, and when the long ward had done its quiet work, when the patient was well enough to walk its length toward the door, there was still the corridor to cross. Beyond it lay another room with another desk, another set of beds, another nurse who had learned to read a ward at a glance. The old hospital corridor always smelled of damp linen and soap. It was not an unpleasant smell, once you grew used to it. It meant that somewhere in the building, someone was washing. And washing was the closest thing the 19th century hospital had to a cure. Before anyone understood that illness could be carried by things too small to see, they fought sickness by fighting smell. Miasma, they called it. Bad air. Rotting breath from drains and wounds and unwashed bodies. If the air was clean, they reasoned, the patient had a chance. And so the hospital became a war against odor, fought with scrub brushes, copper boilers, and endless gallons of hot water. The bathhouse was usually in the basement, where the pipes could reach the boilers more easily. It was a tiled room, often green or white, with a row of deep tubs and a constant steam rising from the taps. New patients were bathed on admission, whether they wanted it or not. For many, this was the first bath they had been offered in weeks. For others, it felt like one more indignity, another stripping away of the self they had brought through the door. The nurses tried to be gentle, but the routine was firm. You could not enter the ward until you had been washed. Upstairs, the laundry was the heart of the hospital's quiet industry. It was a vast, echoing room, filled with the rhythm of irons and the soft collapse of folded cotton. Linen was changed once a week on every ward, and that day was a logistical exercise that required the whole building to cooperate. Baskets of soiled sheets were carried down through the corridors in the early morning, while clean stacks were carried up. The laundry women moved between troughs of hot water and heavy wooden presses, their hands permanently softened and reddened by the steam. Each sheet was boiled, stirred, rinsed, wrung, hung, ironed, folded, and counted. Logbooks recorded every piece. A missing pillowcase was a small crisis. A torn sheet was mended before it was returned to the shelf, because a hospital could never have enough clean linen. The stores room held row after row of folded white cotton, and the sight of it calmed the matron in a way that little else could. The same attention was given to the floors. They were scrubbed on hands and knees with soft soap and sandstone, then dried with cloths until the boards gleamed. The windows were opened at a set hour every morning, regardless of the weather, because the air had to move. The bed frames were wiped with vinegar, the bedpans were scalded, the dressings were burned. All of this happened before germ theory, before Pasteur and Lister, before the word bacteria had entered common speech. Hospitals were already trying to be clean, not because they understood infection, but because they had learned that cleanliness was somehow connected to survival. They had watched the difference between a ward that smelled fresh and a ward that did not. The difference was life. It is easy to smile at their reasoning now. But the discipline they built, the schedules, the logbooks, the scrubbing, the counting, the weekly linen change, became the skeleton upon which modern hospital hygiene was later hung. When science finally arrived with an explanation, the workers in the laundry did not need to change their habits. They had been right all along. As the steam settles and the last basket of folded sheets is carried toward the ward, we might pause in the quiet of the corridor and think of what comes next, because cleanliness alone could not save every patient. The next step was to understand what happened in the ward itself. The daily routines of observation, the charts kept at the bedside, the slow building of a system that turned looking into knowing. That will be the subject of the chapter ahead. Before the chart desk, the hospital was a place of voices and memory. The physician carried his observations in his head, and what he did not carry was lost. A patient might be admitted, treated, discharged, and leave behind nothing but a single line in a register, name, date, a word or two about the complaint, and perhaps the outcome. The rest belonged to recollection, and recollection is the most unreliable of archives. The first admission books were plain things: a heavy ledger, a bottle of ink, a clerk's hand moving slowly across the page. They recorded the barest facts: who arrived, who left, who died. They were not medical records in any modern sense. They were accounting books, really, designed to tell the governors how many beds had been filled and for how long. But even these sparse pages carried something unexpected: the shape of a community. The names of the poor, the elderly, the laborer too ill to work, the woman whose fever would not break. The ledger became a census of suffering, and over time it became something else: a document of care. The real change came with the temperature chart. It seems a small thing now, a piece of paper ruled with lines and marked with dots, but in the middle of the 19th century it was a quiet revolution. A nurse would take a thermometer, wait the required minutes, and mark the result. The next day she would do it again, and again. And gradually the dots formed a line, and the line told a story. The fever rising, the fever breaking, the slow slope of recovery, or the sudden drop that meant the end. For the first time, a patient's progress was visible at a glance. The chart did not replace the physician's judgment, but it gave him something he had never had before: a record of time itself. At the chart desk, the nurse became a writer. Not a clerk, not a secretary, but an observer whose observations mattered. At set intervals, she recorded pulse, temperature, the state of the wound, the amount of food taken, the quality of sleep. These were not dramatic entries. They were small and steady and ordinary, but they formed a trail, and that trail began to shape how medicine was practiced. The doctor arriving on his round could look at the chart and see not just the patient before him, but the patient of the past 3 days, the patient of the past week. The chart was a kind of memory that did not fade. The desk itself was a modest piece of furniture, usually plain wood, set near the ward window where the light was best. A chair, an inkstand, a stack of ledgers, a drawer for the thermometer, and the clean forms. It was not a place of authority but of attention. The sister or the senior nurse sat there during the quieter hours, writing her reports, checking the diet book, noting which patients had taken broth and which had refused it. The sound of the pen was part of the rhythm of the ward, as constant as the ticking of the long case clock at the end of the corridor. These records have outlived their makers. The admission registers, the temperature charts, the diet books, the night reports. They sit now in archives, their pages gone brown at the edges, the ink faded to a pale sepia. But they still speak. They tell us what was eaten, what medicines were given, how long people stayed. They record the names of diseases we no longer see and treatments we no longer use. They also record something quieter, the presence of the women who sat at the chart desk, writing by lamplight while the ward slept, keeping watch with nothing but a pen. What changed when hospitals started writing down patient information every day? The answer is both simple and profound. The patient became a story that continued from one day to the next. The hospital became a place where observation accumulated into knowledge. And the chart desk, humble as it was, became the place where that accumulation began. From the desk, it was only a short step to the lecture hall, where the same observations would be gathered, compared, and taught to the next generation. The night nurse. Before nursing reform, the night attendant was not a nurse, as we understand the word. She was often an older woman from the parish, or a convalescent patient who could no longer pay for her own bed, and stayed on in exchange for a small wage and a place to sleep. Her task was to sit with the sick through the hours of darkness, to fetch water, to call for help if someone died. She had no training, no uniform, no lamp of her own. She sat in the corner of the ward on a hard chair, wrapped in a shawl, and she was expected simply to stay awake. But staying awake through an entire night in a long ward of 40 or more patients was not a simple thing. The ward was lit only by a single oil lamp turned low, placed on a wooden table near the center. The windows were tall and dark, the glass reflecting the small flame back into the room. The beds ran in 2 long rows, each separated by a narrow space just wide enough for a person to pass. The patients were shapes under sheets, some still, some restless, some coughing in their sleep. The only sounds were the breathing of the sleeping, the occasional creak of a bed frame, and the wind outside against the glass. The Nightingale training system changed what it meant to be awake in that room. A trained night nurse did not simply sit. She made rounds, walking the length of the ward every hour, her footsteps soft on the wooden floor. She carried a small lamp or a candle, and she learned to move in such a way that the light did not disturb the sleeping. She adjusted bedclothes that had slipped, checked that the windows were not opened too far, listened to the breathing of each patient as she passed. A change in rhythm, a rattle, a silence where there should be sound. These were things she was trained to notice across a dark room. The medicines were kept in a locked cupboard near the ward door, and the night nurse held the key. She measured doses by the light of her lamp, reading the labels on small glass bottles, her fingers familiar with the shape of each one. She knew which patients were to be given something at 3 in the morning and which were simply to be watched. She recorded what she had done in a ward book, the ink thin in the cold, the entries brief and practical. There was a particular quality required for this work. It was not merely endurance, though endurance was part of it. It was the ability to remain alert in complete stillness, to hold attention without the support of conversation or daylight or urgency. The night nurse worked alone, or with perhaps one other nurse at the far end of the ward. They communicated in gestures and low voices, their movements economical, each action chosen not to wake the row of sleeping shapes between them. The clock on the wall above the desk marked the hours. 2 in the morning was the deepest part of the night, when the ward was quietest and the nurse had to fight hardest against her own weariness. She might stand for a moment at the window, looking out at the dark courtyard or the empty street, the lamp behind her casting her shadow long across the floor. Then she would turn and begin the round again. 4 in the morning brought a change in the air. The darkness thinned, the first grey light touched the window frames, and the ward began to stir. The night nurse made her final checks. She straightened the desk, replaced the lid on the lamp, wrote her last entry. By the time the day nurses arrived, yawning and tying their aprons, she had already folded the night into a report. Who had slept, who had worsened, who had called out in a dream. She handed over the ward, and the lamp, and the key, and then she walked home through streets just beginning to wake, the morning still cold, the world not yet fully lit. She had held a ward of 40 sleeping people in her care, and no one but the patients would ever know what that had meant. The old hospital corridor at that hour held only the sound of her footsteps fading and the quiet closing of the door. And when the day nurse took her place beside the beds, the work continued into the light. The operating theatre beyond the corridor was being prepared, the instruments laid out on clean cloth, the surgeon's coat hung ready on its hook. The antiseptic cabinet. Before the antiseptic cabinet arrived, the surgeon operated in a coat that had been worn all week. The same coat, the same sleeves, the same apron, stiff with old blood and pus. It was not considered unprofessional. It was simply how things were done. The wound would fester, the patient would fever, and the family would be told that God had taken their loved one. No one connected the coat to the death. They could not see what they had no words for. Then a quiet surgeon in Glasgow began to suspect that the invisible world was real. Joseph Lister had read the work of Louis Pasteur, who had shown that tiny living things floated in the air and multiplied in rotting matter. If these organisms caused decay, Lister reasoned, they might also cause the infections that killed surgical patients. And if carbolic acid could kill them in a sewer, perhaps it could kill them on a wound. So began the experiment that would change the smell of every hospital corridor. Lister designed a spray, a fine mist of carbolic acid that could be directed at the operating field, the surgeon's hands, the instruments, the air itself. The machine sat on a table or hung from a bracket, a brass or glass canister with a hand pump, hissing a thin white cloud into the room. It smelled sharp and chemical, nothing like the familiar odors of sickness and unwashed linen. Patients who entered the operating theatre for the first time must have found it strange and alarming, this fog that stung the eyes and caught in the throat. But they survived in numbers never seen before. The results were so dramatic that even skeptical surgeons had to take notice. Where amputation had once killed 1 in 3, Lister's ward saw patients walk out with healing stumps and clear skin. The spray became a symbol of a new kind of medicine, one that fought not just with the knife, but with the invisible. Soon, the hospital corridor began to fill with objects that had not existed a decade earlier. Glass cabinets appeared at the ends of wards, their shelves stacked with rolls of lint, folded gauze, rubber drainage tubes, and bottles of carbolic solution. Steam sterilizers replaced boiling pots. Rubber gloves, first used to protect a nurse's hands from the harsh chemicals, were soon understood to protect the patient as well. The white coat began to replace the everyday apron, not because it was fashionable, but because it could be washed and would show the dirt that must not reach a wound. Nurses, who had once spent their days emptying bedpans and changing soiled sheets, now learned a new language of preparation. They soaked instruments in carbolic, wrapped dressings in sterilized paper, and kept the glass cabinet locked and orderly. The nurse became the guardian of a new kind of cleanliness, one that had nothing to do with moral virtue and everything to do with the invisible life on a surgeon's hands. The operating theatre itself changed shape. Wooden tables gave way to iron or enamel. Floors were scrubbed with carbolic. The hiss of the spray became the background sound of surgical work, as familiar as the ticking of the ward clock. Not every hospital adopted Lister's methods at once. Some resisted. Old surgeons called the spray a fad and continued to operate in their stained coats. But the results could not be argued with forever. Ward by ward, city by city, the antiseptic cabinet appeared. A glass door. Neat rows of instruments. The smell of chemicals, sharp and alive. The old hospital corridor had smelled of sickness, of old straw, of unwashed bodies. Now it began to smell of something else. Not comfort, not yet, but something that spoke of a world where infection was no longer inevitable. And as the nurse turned the key in the cabinet door and the surgeon pulled on his rubber gloves, the corridor began to prepare for the dawn of a different kind of hospital. One where the patient might, for the first time, expect to survive. At the far end of the hospital corridor, past the laundry, past the kitchen, past the ward where the beds stood in long white rows, there was a door that opened onto a new kind of room. It was small, often the smallest room in the building. A wooden bench ran along one wall. On it sat a microscope, a few glass slides, a rack of staining fluids, and a notebook. This was the hospital laboratory. It did not arrive with fanfare. There was no ceremony, no announcement. It simply appeared, usually because one physician had become convinced that the future of medicine would be found not at the bedside alone, but at the lens. That physician would persuade the hospital board to spare a room, would bring his own microscope from home, would spend his evenings peering at stained tissue and recording what he saw in careful hand-drawn diagrams. The laboratory was a passion project before it was a department. In the late 19th century, hospitals across Europe and America began making space for these tiny rooms. The idea was unsettling to some. For centuries, diagnosis had meant looking at the patient, their pallor, their pulse, their breath, the quality of their sweat. A physician listened to the story of the illness and read it in the face and body. Now here was a room where diagnosis happened, not at the bedside, but at the bench, where the patient was represented by a sliver of tissue on a glass slide, by a drop of blood, by a smear of sputum. The microscope turned diagnosis into a visual science. For the first time, a doctor could see the enemy. He could look at a patient's blood and find the spiraling shape of a malaria parasite. He could stain a piece of tissue and see the disorganized growth of a tumor. He could hold a slide up to the light and know, with a certainty that no amount of bedside experience could match, what was happening inside the living body. The hospital laboratory was often a cramped and lonely place. It had one window, usually north-facing, for the most even light. The bench held a row of stoppered bottles, methylene blue, eosin, carmine, hematoxylin. A spirit lamp for heating stains. A dish of distilled water. A jar of specimens preserved in alcohol. The pathologist, if the hospital was lucky enough to have one, worked in silence. He kept a notebook in which he drew what he saw, cells with dark nuclei, strange shapes, thread-like bacteria clustered like bundles of sticks. The drawings were precise and beautiful, made with the same care that earlier naturalists had used to record new species of birds or beetles. Each one was a discovery. The lab report became a new kind of hospital document. It joined the admission register, the diet book, the chart at the foot of the bed. A slip of paper would arrive on the ward, a few lines in careful handwriting describing what had been found under the microscope. The physician reading it held in his hands a message from the invisible world. The patient's illness had a name now, a shape, an address. Not every hospital could afford a laboratory. Smaller institutions sent specimens across town in a basket, carried by a porter who had no idea what he was transporting. The samples would arrive at a medical school or a larger hospital where someone with a microscope would examine them and send back the report. The turnaround could take days. But even this was progress. The hospital was no longer just a place where people came to be cared for. It was becoming a place where the nature of illness was investigated, mapped, and understood. The laboratory at the end of the corridor changed the rhythm of the hospital. It introduced a new kind of quiet. The wards had their own sounds, the rustle of linen, the soft tread of nurses, the murmur of voices. But the laboratory was silent except for the scratch of a pen and the click of a microscope stage being adjusted. It was a room of concentration, of patience, of waiting for a stain to develop, of holding a slide at just the right angle to catch the light. It demanded a different kind of attention, slower, more solitary, more systematic. And it connected the hospital to something larger. The same kinds of microscopes stood in laboratories across the world. A physician in London and a physician in Berlin could look at the same bacterium and know they were seeing the same thing. The hospital was no longer isolated, reliant on local tradition and the memory of older doctors. It was part of a network of observation, a shared project of seeing clearly. The laboratory began in a small room, but that small room held the seed of everything the hospital would become. It was the place where medicine learned to look closer, to wait, to ask questions of the smallest pieces of the human body. And when you walked past that closed door at the end of the corridor, you knew that inside someone was watching, recording, trying to understand the story that the microscope alone could tell. The office of the old hospital was not always a room. In the early days, the administration of a charity hospital might have been conducted from a corner of the matron's sitting room or from a portable desk carried between wards. A single book, the admission ledger, held the names of every patient who entered. A single clerk, often a retired tradesman or a junior clergyman, kept the accounts and wrote the letters. The hospital ran not on systems but on the memory and diligence of a few overworked people. But as the 19th century advanced, the hospital grew beyond the reach of one desk. The wards multiplied, the staff expanded, the supplies grew more complex. Coal had to be ordered by the ton, linen by the bolt, medicines by the dram. Cooks had to be paid, laundresses supervised, builders called when the roof leaked. And all of this had to be recorded, because the hospital was accountable to its governors, to its subscribers, and, in a quieter sense, to the public whose donations kept the doors open. The administration office appeared as a separate room, then as a suite of rooms. It had a door that closed, a window that looked not onto the ward, but onto the street or the courtyard. Inside stood a high desk of dark wood, where the chief clerk worked standing, his ledger open before him, his pen dipped in ink of a regulation black. Behind him, shelves rose to the ceiling, packed with bound volumes, admission registers, discharge books, death registers, order books, letter books. Each volume had a spine label in careful copperplate, the year, the department, the type of record. The hospital secretary became a figure of considerable power. He knew the finances better than the physicians did. He decided which debts could be pursued and which forgiven, which suppliers were reliable, which nurses had been late too often. He sat in board meetings and wrote the minutes, his pen scratching quietly while the governors debated. He was the memory of the institution, the one who could find, in a moment, the entry for a patient admitted 10 years ago, or the cost of a ton of coal in 1873. The daily work of the office had a rhythm of its own. The Morning Post brought letters from patients seeking admission, from doctors requesting beds, from manufacturers offering bandages at a discount. The clerk sorted these into piles: urgent, routine, donations, complaints. He opened the donations with a paper knife, recorded the amount in the subscription book, and wrote a receipt to be posted by return. Coal orders were copied into the order book, then passed to the porter. Requests for burials, for the hospital had its own burial ground, and the cost of a pauper funeral was part of the budget, were sent to the chaplain. The annual report was the great ritual of the administrative year. Every number was checked. Every expense was justified. The report listed how many patients had been admitted, how many discharged, how many died. It listed the donations, from the wealthy subscriber who gave £100 to the parish collection that amounted to a few shillings. It named the physicians and surgeons, the matron and the chaplain, the secretary and the clerks. It was printed on good paper, bound in plain covers, and distributed to the governors and subscribers. It was a public promise that the hospital had been careful with what it had been given. Filing systems emerged slowly. At first, everything was kept in the bound ledgers, indexed by hand. Then came the wooden filing cabinet, with its rows of suspended folders, and the copying press, which allowed a clerk to make a duplicate of every letter he wrote. Printed forms began to replace handwritten ones. Admission forms, discharge forms, orders for stores. The administration office became a place of printed paper, of carbon copies, of rubber stamps that declared paid, received, approved, filed. The clerks themselves were a quiet tribe. They did not wear uniform, but they dressed soberly: dark coats, clean collars, sleeves protected by paper cuffs. They wrote in a script trained by years of copying, a script that was clear, even, and entirely without flourish. They spoke in low voices. They did not discuss the contents of the ledgers. They were discreet, reliable, and largely invisible. The patients on the wards never saw them. The physicians passed through the office only when they needed a bed or a signature. And yet the office held the hospital together. Without the admission book, a patient could not be registered. Without the order book, the kitchen could not obtain food. Without the salary ledger, the nurses would not be paid. The desk at the center of that room, with its ledger open and its ink still wet, was the quiet heart of the institution. Not as dramatic as the operating theatre, not as tender as the ward, but just as necessary. And as the office grew busier, as the filing cabinets multiplied and the forms became more numerous, another change was coming. The corridor outside the administration door was growing quieter, the lamps being turned down one by one. It was nearly dawn, and the hospital was preparing for a different kind of light. The visiting physician arrived on Tuesday morning. His carriage stopped at the hospital gate, and he stepped out not as an employee, but as a benefactor. He wore a black coat and carried a walking stick, and his hat hung on a peg in the small room set aside for his use. He gave his time for nothing. The hospital paid him no salary. In the 18th and 19th centuries, this was how most hospitals worked. The physicians and surgeons who treated the poor did so without charge, and the arrangement was understood by everyone. The hospital needed doctors. The doctors needed the hospital. The title of honorary physician or honorary surgeon carried real weight. Appointment to a hospital post was a mark of credibility that could not be bought. It meant a doctor had been judged worthy by his peers, and that judgment opened doors. Private patients sought out a man who walked the wards of a charity hospital. They trusted him because the hospital had trusted him first. The unpaid post became, in time, the most valuable asset a physician could hold. Tuesday was his day. The visiting physician entered the ward at 9 o'clock or 10, or sometimes later if his private round had run long. The sister met him at the door with the ward book in her hand. Behind him came the students, 3 or 4 or sometimes a dozen, carrying notebooks and pencils. They clustered at the foot of each bed as the physician moved from one patient to the next. He did not sit. There was no time to sit. He might see 50 patients in a single morning, making a decision at each bed in the space of a few minutes. A glance at the pulse, a question about the bowels, a hand placed on the forehead. The students wrote down what he said. The sister noted his instructions. The procession moved on. The hospital offered the physician something he could not find in his private practice. In the rooms of wealthy patients, disease followed a predictable pattern. Fevers were managed, pains were soothed, and the slow decline of age was met with quiet resignation. But in the hospital wards, the physician encountered the unusual. Tumors the size of melons. Fevers that burned through a body in 3 days. Fractures that had healed wrong and been broken again. The hospital was a library of living illness, and the visiting physician was its most diligent reader. He built his knowledge here, and that knowledge made him valuable elsewhere. The students benefited most of all. A young man training in medicine could read books and attend lectures, but the real education happened at the bedside. He watched the physician's hands. He listened to the questions. He learned to read the small signs that mattered. The ward round was a moving classroom, and the physician was the teacher who never stopped walking. Some students were allowed to examine a patient themselves. Others were asked to describe what they saw. The best of them were given a bed to follow, a single case to watch from admission to discharge. This bedside teaching became the foundation of medical training, and the visiting physician was its reluctant architect. He taught because teaching was part of the post, not because he had chosen to be a teacher. The system created a tension that ran beneath the surface of every hospital. The charitable mission of the institution demanded that care be given freely to the poor. But the physicians who gave that care were also building their careers. A hospital post was a stepping stone. The patients who filled the beds were the raw material of professional advancement. It was not a cruelty. The patients received care they could not have afforded elsewhere, and the physicians gave time they could have spent earning. But the arrangement was never entirely comfortable, and the most honest of the honorary doctors knew it. The visiting physician was also a gatekeeper. He decided who was admitted and who was sent away. He decided which patients were worth teaching on and which were left in peace. He decided, in practice if not in official policy, which cases would be remembered and which would be forgotten. The ward book recorded his decisions in neat columns: name, age, complaint, admission date, discharge. The physician's signature sat at the bottom of each page, and with that signature the patient became part of the hospital's memory. At the end of the morning, the visiting physician returned to the small room where his hat still hung on the peg. He put on his coat. He picked up his walking stick. He walked out through the corridor and into the daylight, and the hospital would not see him again until the following Tuesday. The students scattered to their lodgings. The sister closed the ward book. The patients who had been examined lay back in their beds, and the ward grew quiet again. The visiting physician had gone, but the hospital carried on. It kept the routines he had set in motion, the treatments he had ordered, the observations he had asked for. His work was done for the week, but the rhythm of the ward did not stop. It waited for Tuesday, when the black coat would pass through the gate once more, and the walking stick would tap its way down the corridor. There is no door at the front of the old hospital marked ambulance. There is a gate, wide enough for a cart, and beside it, a gas lamp that burns all night. The gate opens onto a short lane leading to a receiving room, a plain room with a bench, a table, a chair, and a rack for a stretcher. This is how the hospital learned to receive the sudden injured, and it took a very long time to learn. Before any of this existed, a person struck down by accident or violence lay where they fell or was carried home. Families and neighbors did what they could. If the injury was grave and the family poor, someone might borrow a handcart and wheel the sufferer through the streets to the nearest hospital. Others were carried on a door lifted from its hinges, or walked supported between two companions, or simply left at the hospital step in the night. The hospital was not yet a place you went to for help. It was a place you went to when everything else had failed, and even then the journey itself was an ordeal. The first organized ambulances did not appear on city streets. They appeared on battlefields. Military surgeons learned that a wounded man carried quickly and carefully to field hospital had a better chance than one left to wait. They designed wagons with springs, with space for a stretcher, with a driver who knew the route. The lesson traveled slowly back to civilian life, as such lessons do, carried by surgeons who had served and returned to their city hospitals. In the growing industrial towns, the need became plain in a different way. A railway worker crushed between buffers, a mill hand with an arm caught in a belt, a laborer fallen from scaffolding. These were not illnesses that crept in over weeks. They were sudden, catastrophic, and they arrived at the hospital gate without warning. The gate itself became a threshold not just for the planned poor, the chronic sick admitted by signed order, but for a new kind of patient, the emergency. The receiving room was the hospital's answer to this new demand. It sat near the gate, close enough that a stretcher could be carried inside without climbing steps. There was a bench where the patient could be laid, a table for the surgeon's instruments, a basin of water, a clean cloth. A bell or a speaking tube connected the room to the wards above. The porter on night duty knew to keep the lamp lit and the door unlocked. The room was not elaborate. It was simply ready. The horse-drawn ambulance, when it finally arrived in civilian service, was a remarkable sight. Painted and marked, pulled by a horse trained to stand quietly at the scene, it carried a driver and an attendant inside a compartment fitted with padded slings and a fold-down stretcher. The ride was far from smooth. Cobblestones saw to that, but it was faster and gentler than a cart, and it meant the patient arrived sheltered from rain and dust and the staring eyes of the street. The corridor beyond the receiving room began to fill with a new kind of motion, purposeful, unhurried, but never stopping. The ambulance gate changed the hospital's relationship with the city. Before, the hospital waited. Patients came or did not come, and the wards received whoever arrived. After, the hospital reached out. The gate became a place where the city and the hospital met at speed, where a lantern swinging in the dark meant someone was coming, and the receiving room was already prepared. So the old hospital corridor learned to receive the injured. It adapted its routines, added a bell by the gate, kept a stretcher racked and ready. The change was gradual, practical, and driven by the simplest of observations, that a person bleeding at the roadside needs help sooner than a person lying in a ward, and that the distance between the street and the surgeon's table matters in minutes that count. And after the receiving room came the next quiet transformation, for the hospital did not only receive the injured through that gate, it began to send help back out. But that is a story for another chapter. The corridor at dawn is not a dramatic place. There is no rush of stretchers, no urgent voices, no clatter of instruments being prepared. There is only the long, narrow passage stretching toward the eastern window, where the first light of morning has begun to gather. It falls in a pale rectangle across the floorboards, still dusted with the fine powder of last night's sweeping. The mop stands in its bucket by the far wall. The ward doors are closed. For a few minutes each day, the old hospital corridor belongs to no one but itself. It was not always so quiet. In the early years of these buildings, the corridor was where families waited, with nothing but worry, where the sick were carried in on stretchers because they could no longer walk, where the smell of unwashed linen and tallow candles hung in the air long after the lamps were lit. The corridor was the last threshold. Beyond it lay a ward, where hope was not expected, only care of the most basic kind, a bed, a balance, a bowl of broth, a prayer. But the corridor changed. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, it began to fill with other things. Not just bodies, but routines. The laundress passed through at the same hour each morning, her arms full of folded sheets. The porter wheeled a trolley of clean towels toward the side ward. The night nurse paused by the window to mark the last entry in her log, the ink still wet, before handing the record to the day sister. The corridor became a spine, and along that spine, the hospital began to organize itself into something new. It was not one discovery that did this. There was no single moment when the old hospital corridor became a place of healing rather than a place of waiting. It was 1,000 small disciplines, repeated until they became ordinary. Washing hands before touching a dressing, recording a temperature at the same time each day, measuring a dose by the same measure each time, training a nurse to notice whether a patient had drunk water, eaten bread, slept through the night. These were not heroic acts. They were habits. But habits, repeated across enough days and enough corridors, changed what a hospital was. By the early years of the 20th century, the corridor had become something its builders had not imagined. It was still narrow. It still smelled of soap and floor wax and the faint starch of clean linen. But the people who walked it no longer came only because they had no other choice. They came because they believed, for the first time, that the building at the end of the street might be able to help them. The corridor had become a passage, not toward the end of hope, but toward its beginning. The light through the eastern window grows stronger now. Dust motes turn slowly in the air, catching the gold of the morning. Somewhere, a door opens. Footsteps approach, unhurried. The day's work is about to begin, as it has begun every day for more than a century. The old hospital corridor does not speak, but if it could, it might remind us that the quietest spaces often hold the deepest memory. The corridor at dawn is not just a hallway. It is a place where the past walks alongside the present and where the promise of care, so long in coming, finally learned to stay. The old hospital corridor is quiet now. The lamps have been turned low, the last ward round finished. The night nurse has made her final passage from one end to the other. There is a particular quality to this hour, not quite night, not quite morning, when the building seems to hold its breath. The floorboards have stopped creaking under urgent feet. The voices that echoed along these walls through every chapter of this story have fallen silent, one by one. And yet the corridor is not empty. It never truly is. If you stand here at dawn, when the first grey light begins to find its way through the high window at the far end, you can feel the weight of all that has passed through this space. The families who walked this corridor with their hands clasped, not knowing whether they were leading their loved one toward help or toward goodbye. The charity board members who sat in that small side room, deciding whose suffering was worthy of a ticket. The nuns who moved silently along these stones, their rosaries clicking like a quiet heartbeat, tending to bodies they believed were temporary vessels for eternal souls. The probationer nurses, young and terrified and determined, learning to fold a sheet corner just so, because they had been told that precision was the first step toward compassion. The surgeons who strode through with blood on their aprons, proud of having finished an amputation in 47 seconds before the patient could fully understand what was happening. The visiting physicians in their black coats walking ahead of a trail of students, stopping briefly at each bed to pronounce a Latin name for a disease no one knew how to cure. All of them used this corridor. All of them are still here, in a way. What transformed the old hospital was not a single discovery, though we often tell the story that way. We like to point to a date, a name, a eureka moment. Lister with his carbolic spray, Nightingale with her lamp, the first whisper of ether in a Massachusetts operating room. But the real transformation was slower and quieter. It was made of 1,000 small disciplines, each one unremarkable on its own, each one adding a thread to a rope that would eventually pull the hospital from the edge of the town into the center of hope. Washing hands, recording temperatures, sterilizing instruments, changing bed linen on a schedule, feeding patients not whatever was left over, but food chosen for their condition. Training nurses not as a charitable afterthought, but as a profession with standards, examinations, and a uniform that commanded respect. Writing things down, writing everything down, so that the next shift, the next day, the next generation could look at a chart and see what had been tried and what had worked. These small disciplines began as experiments in single wards, championed by stubborn individuals who believed that order could defeat disease. Then they spread along the corridors to the next ward, and the next, and the next, until the whole building breathed differently. The smell changed. The old hospital had smelled of sickness, of unwashed bodies and rotting dressings, and the sweetish odor of gangrene. The new hospital smelled of carbolic soap, of clean linen, of floor polish, the unglamorous perfume of care. And the corridor changed too. It was no longer a passage that led only one way. It became something else, a place where you might walk in afraid and walk out hopeful. The same stones, the same high ceiling, the same window at the far end. But the building around it had learned what a hospital was for. It had taken centuries. Thousands of patients had passed through these doors who never walked out again, and their presence lingers in the quiet of this hour. The old hospital does not forget. The corridor remembers the weight of every stretcher, every slow procession, every pair of feet that paused at the threshold and had to be coaxed forward. It remembers the night nurse who sat with a feverish child until the fever broke, the diet kitchen sister who insisted on making beef tea from real beef, even when the budget was thin, the laboratory physician who stayed late to peer through his microscope at a slide that would change the way a disease was understood. These people did not know they were part of a transformation. They were just doing their work, washing, recording, measuring, training, organizing, one small discipline after another. but the corridor holds them all. And if you listen closely, in the stillness before the day shift arrives, you can hear the echo of their footsteps. The first light is stronger now. The window at the end of the corridor glows pale gold. Somewhere in the building, a door opens and closes with a soft click. The first sound of the new day. The mop stands against the wall where the night porter left it. The ward doors are closed, but behind them, patients are waking. Nurses are checking charts. The kitchen is lighting its stoves. The long work of healing is about to begin again. The old hospital corridor has seen it all. The fear and the hope, the despair and the small victories, the centuries of slow learning. It is just a passage, away from one place to another. But it is also something more. It is the quiet space where the past walks alongside the present, where every step you take is a step someone else took before you, and where the simple act of walking toward help became, over time, an act of ordinary courage. The corridor is empty now, but it is full. So let the old hospital rest. Let the corridor settle into the quiet of the morning. Let the stories that live in these walls fade gently into the hush, the way voices fade when you are already half asleep. The building will stand for a few more hours, a few more years, a few more generations. But for now, there is only the long, quiet view toward the window at the far end, the dust motes drifting in the early light, and the soft, steady breath of a place that learned, at last, how to heal. There is a particular quality to the light in an old hospital corridor, and it has nothing to do with the windows. It is a light that has passed through dust and time and the slow accumulation of countless small moments. The dust motes themselves are old, lifted from floorboards that were laid when Victoria was still on the throne, stirred by the passing of aprons and coats and the trailing hems of uniforms that have long since faded from memory. Each mote catches the morning sun and hangs there, suspended, as if the air itself is reluctant to let go of what it has held. Consider the floorboards first, because they are the oldest thing in this corridor, apart from the silence. They are not the floorboards you would find in a modern hospital, sealed and smooth and easy to clean. These are wide planks of English oak, darkened by a century of polish and footsteps and the slow seep of time. They creak in specific places. The third board from the door, the one near the wall where the porter's trolley always stopped. The loose corner where generations of probationer nurses learned to walk quietly so as not to wake the sleeping. If you were to kneel and run your hand across the grain, you would feel the indentations, the slight hollows worn by hundreds of thousands of footsteps passing over the same spot. The corridor has been scrubbed and swept and waxed more times than anyone could count, but it still bears the memory of every person who walked it. The walls, too, tell their own story. They are painted in what was once called hospital green, a color chosen not for its pleasantness, but for its practicality. Dark enough to hide the marks of use, light enough to catch the eye of a night nurse making her rounds with a single oil lamp. The paint is thick in some places, thin in others, applied in layers that stretch across decades. If you looked closely, you might find the ghost of an earlier color beneath, a pale cream from the 1860s perhaps, or the dark brown that was thought to be more dignified in the 1890s. Each layer represents a decision made by a hospital committee, a debate over budgets and aesthetics, a week of disruption while the painters set up their ladders and the patients were moved to other wards. But the walls remember every color they have worn. The door at the far end of the corridor is not a grand door. It is a plain door. 6 panels of painted wood with a brass handle that has been polished so often it has begun to soften at the edges. The handle is warm to the touch, not from the sun, but from the hands that have turned it. Thousands of hands, tens of thousands. each one pausing for a fraction of a second before pushing the door open and stepping through. The brass has lost its original sharpness. The maker's mark has been worn almost smooth, and what remains is a gentle gleam that speaks of use rather than display. There is a small glass pane set into the upper half of the door, and through it you can see the corridor beyond, receding into the distance like a tunnel through time. But let us stop here for a moment and listen, because the old hospital corridor has a sound of its own, and it is not the silence you might expect. Listen past the ringing in your ears, past the distant murmur of traffic from the world outside, and you will hear something else. A faint ticking, irregular, like a clock that has been wound unevenly. It is the sound of the pipes, of course. The hot water pipes that run beneath the floor, carrying steam from the boiler house to the radiators in every ward. The pipes expand and contract as the water heats and cools, and each expansion produces a small metallic click, a sound so familiar to the night nurses that they scarcely notice it anymore. But it is there, always, a quiet heartbeat in the bones of the building. Above, the ceiling rises higher than you might expect, perhaps 15 feet at its peak. It is a ceiling designed for a time when people believed that fresh air and lofty spaces were the best medicine for every complaint. The Victorians were deeply concerned with ventilation, and they had reason to be. Before the germ theory of disease was properly understood, physicians believed that sickness was carried by bad air, miasma, they called it, and that the best defense was a constant circulation of fresh air. So hospital ceilings were built high to allow the air to rise and disperse, and windows were designed to open at both top and bottom, so that warm, stale air could escape from above, while cool, clean air entered from below. The old corridor still has these windows, tall and narrow, each one fitted with a brass catch that has to be turned with a particular technique, a turn and a pull, before the sash will budge. The windows look out onto a courtyard, and through the glass you can see the outline of an old mulberry tree, planted perhaps 150 years ago by a surgeon who had a fondness for its fruit. The tree has grown gnarled with age, its branches twisting in ways that suggest a difficult life, storms and droughts, and the shadow of the building that rose beside it. But it still bears fruit in late summer, and the nurses who work in the wards overlooking the courtyard still gather the berries to make jam in the hospital kitchen. This is the kind of continuity that the old hospital specializes in, small traditions passed from one generation to the next, unrecorded and unremarkable, but persisting nonetheless. Further along the corridor, set into the wall at about waist height, there is a brass plate. It is about the size of a hand, and it bears an inscription so worn that you have to run your finger across the letters to read them. The inscription reads, "This corridor was opened by Her Royal Highness the Princess Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, October the 12th, 1887. Princess Christian was Queen Victoria's fifth child, known before her marriage as Princess Helena. She was a patron of nursing and of hospitals, and she visited this one on a grey autumn afternoon to declare the new wing open. The corridor was new then, smelling of fresh paint and sawdust, and the nurses lined up in their best uniforms to watch a princess walk its length. They probably expected the corridor to change their work, to make it easier or more efficient. They could not have known that the corridor itself would become the thing that was remembered. Just past the brass plate, there is a door on the left. It is a different kind of door, narrower, with a frosted glass panel and a sign that reads Matron's Office in faded gold letters. The sign has been there for so long that the paint has cracked and flaked, and the word office is now missing its final E in places, so that it reads almost as office. But nobody has replaced it, and nobody will, because the sign is part of the corridor's character. Behind that door, for more than 60 years, a succession of matrons held court, each one bringing her own philosophy to the running of the hospital. Some were strict, demanding that every surface be polished until you could see your face in it. Others were more lenient, preferring to focus on the comfort of the patients rather than the shine of the floors. But all of them understood that the corridor was the nerve center of the hospital, the place where information flowed from ward to ward, where messengers ran with notes and telegrams, where the pulse of the institution could be felt. The matron's office has a fireplace, though it has not been lit in decades. The fireplace is small, designed for coal rather than wood, and it is surrounded by green tiles that were fashionable in the 1880s. Above the mantelpiece hangs a photograph of the hospital's founder, a man in a high collar and a beard that covers most of his chest. He looks serious, as everyone did in photographs from that era. But there is a gentleness in his eyes that suggests he was not as stern as his appearance might suggest. He founded this hospital as a small infirmary in a rented house with 6 beds and a single nurse. And from that humble beginning, it grew into the institution whose corridor we are now walking. His desk is still there, pushed against the wall, its surface covered with the ghosts of letters and ledgers and lists of supplies that had to last until the next quarter. A little further on, the corridor widens into a small alcove. This was once the waiting area for the outpatient clinic, and the benches that line the walls are original. They are made of dark oak, polished to a shine by the countless people who sat on them, waiting to be seen by a doctor. The benches are hard, deliberately so, because it was believed that discomfort would discourage people from lingering unnecessarily and clogging up the system. But people lingered anyway, because they were frightened, and because the journey to the hospital had been long, and because they needed a moment to gather themselves before they stepped into the consulting room. The alcove has a high window that catches the afternoon sun, and on sunny days the light falls across the benches in a way that softens the grain of the wood and makes the dust motes dance. It is worth pausing here to consider the dust itself, because the old hospital has a particular relationship with dust. The dust in a hospital corridor is not the same as the dust in an ordinary building. It is finer, for one thing, more like a powder than a fluff, because it has been walked over so many times that the coarser particles have been ground down. It is also older. Some of this dust may date back to the 1880s, when the wing was built, carried in on the boots of workmen and the hems of visitors, and settling into the gaps between the floorboards where no broom could reach. Each time the corridor is swept, some of the dust is removed, but some remains, sifting down into the cracks and crevices, forming a kind of archive of the building's life. A forensic scientist with a microscope might be able to tell you what was being built in the neighborhood in the 1890s by analyzing the composition of the dust, or what kind of coal was being burned in the hospital's boiler in the winter of 1903. The corridor keeps these secrets without judgment. The alcove also contains one of the few remaining gas lamp fittings in the hospital. It is a brass bracket mounted on the wall with a frosted glass shade that has been cracked and repaired with a thin line of glue. The gas has long been disconnected, but the bracket remains, a relic of the time before electricity transformed the hospital's nights. In those days, the corridor at night was a dim and shadowy place, lit only by a few such lamps turned low to save fuel and to allow the patients to sleep. The nurses carried their own lamps, small oil lamps with a single wick, designed to cast a narrow pool of light on the floor ahead of them. You can still find these lamps in the hospital museum, if you know where to look, each one engraved with a number that corresponds to a nurse's station. The lamps were cleaned and filled every afternoon by the junior nurses, a ritual that taught them patience and attention to detail. Fill the lamp too full, and the oil would spill. Fill it too little, and the light would fail before the shift was over. Every probationer learned the exact level of the oil, the exact height of the wick, the exact moment when the glass chimney was cool enough to polish. Think about that for a moment. An entire generation of nurses learned their trade by the light of a lamp, and the lamp itself was a lesson. The flame had to be steady, because a flickering lamp made the patients nervous. The glass had to be clear, because a smoke chimney reduced the light and strained the eyes. The brass had to be polished, because the matron inspected every lamp before the night shift began, and woe betide the nurse whose lamp was not up to standard. These were not arbitrary rules. They were the disciplines that turned a well-meaning young woman into a professional who could be trusted with a ward of 40 beds in the middle of the night, when there was no one else to turn to, and the nearest doctor was a mile away. Let us move on, past the alcove, past the door that leads to the women's surgical ward, past the small plaque that commemorates a donation from the local brewing family. A plaque that some members of the hospital board would prefer to forget, and others insist on keeping. Because history is not tidy, and neither is the old hospital. The corridor bends slightly here, following the line of the original building's foundation. And as it bends, it passes a window that looks out onto the hospital garden. The garden is small, perhaps the size of a tennis court, and it is enclosed by a high brick wall that is covered in ivy. In the center of the garden, there is a fountain, long since dry, its basin filled with fallen leaves and the occasional splash of color from a flower that has bloomed without anyone planting it. The garden was designed in the 1890s, when the idea of fresh air and green spaces as therapy was beginning to gain traction among progressive physicians. The hospital's chief physician at the time, a man who had studied in Paris and Vienna, insisted that the garden be built as a place where convalescent patients could sit in the sun and breathe air that had not been filtered through a sick room. He was overruled by the hospital board, who considered the project an unnecessary expense, and he funded it himself from his own salary. The garden was his gift to the patients, and it still bears his name, inscribed on a stone set into the wall. The Haslam Garden, established 1893, for the rest and recreation of the sick. The corridor passes the garden window and continues toward the main staircase. This staircase is one of the finest features of the old hospital, a grand Victorian staircase with a mahogany handrail and cast iron balusters that were made in a local foundry. The handrail is worn smooth at the height of a hand, and if you look closely, you can see the slight dip where generations of nurses and doctors and porters and patients have placed their hands as they climbed the stairs. The steps themselves are marble, or a reasonable imitation of marble, and they are polished to a high gloss. But they are not even. The center of each step is slightly lower than the edges, worn down by roughly a century of footsteps. The builders who laid these stairs in 1887 did not anticipate that the hospital would still be in use 130 years later, but the stairs have adapted. They have settled into the shape of the traffic, the way a well-used path across a field becomes a permanent feature of the landscape. At the top of the staircase, the corridor opens out into a wider space, almost a room in itself. This was the waiting hall for the surgical theatre, and it is dominated by a large clock that hangs on the wall opposite the stairs. The clock is a fine piece of Victorian craftsmanship with a mahogany case and a face of enamelled metal. The hands are wrought iron, black and ornate, and they move with a slow, deliberate sweep that seems to measure not just minutes, but the whole weight of time. The clock was donated by the hospital's first surgical team, a group of 5 men who performed the first operations in the new theatre, and who wanted to leave a permanent mark on the building. They chose a clock, perhaps because they understood that surgery is about timing. about knowing not just what to do, but when to do it and how long to take. The clock still works, wound weekly by the hospital's maintenance man who has been doing the job for 30 years. He learned the winding pattern from his predecessor, who learned it from his, and so on in an unbroken chain that stretches back to the 1880s. The clock does not keep perfect time. It gains about 3 minutes a week, but nobody has ever adjusted it, because the small discrepancy has become part of the hospital's character. The nurses know that the clock is fast, and they add a few minutes to their mental calculations when they check it. The patients do not know, and the clock's cheerful inaccuracy troubles no one. Beneath the clock, there is a wooden bench, longer and more comfortable than the benches in the outpatient alcove. This bench was reserved for the families of patients undergoing surgery, and it bears the marks of its use. The slight indentations where people sat forward, elbows on knees, hands clasped, waiting for news. The wood is darker in the center, where more people sat, and lighter at the ends, where fewer did. You could read the history of the hospital's surgery simply by looking at the distribution of wear on this bench. The way an archaeologist reads the floor of a medieval church to understand where the congregation stood. Beyond the waiting hall, the corridor continues toward the old surgical theater itself. The door to the theater is kept locked now, because the room has been turned into a storage space. But if you peer through the small window set into the door, you can see the faint outline of the operating table. A wooden table with metal fittings, its surface scarred and marked by decades of use. The theater is a room of shadows now, filled with boxes and filing cabinets and the accumulated debris of a working hospital. But it was once the site of extraordinary drama. Here, before the age of anesthesia, patients were held down by strong orderlies while surgeons worked with terrifying speed. Here, the first antiseptic operations were performed, the carbolic spray filling the air with its sharp, clean smell. Here, the first X-ray machine was installed, a cumbersome device that filled the room with the crackle of static electricity and the acrid smell of ozone. But the old theater is silent now, and the corridor is silent too, in the way that old buildings are silent. Not truly silent, but filled with the small sounds that only become audible when everything else has been stilled. The creak of a floorboard expanding in the morning warmth, the distant clatter of a pot in the kitchen, the murmur of voices from a ward somewhere out of sight, the sound of water running through the pipes, a constant rush that is so familiar it is only noticed when it stops. Let us turn back now and walk the corridor in the other direction, toward the point where we began. The light has shifted as the morning has progressed, and the window at the far end glows with a different quality. The dust motes are still there, still suspended, still catching the light in their slow drift. The floorboards still creak in their familiar places. The brass handle of the far door still gleams with the warmth of countless hands. But there is something else now, something that was not there before. Or perhaps it was there all along, and we were not yet ready to notice it. It is the sense that this corridor is not just a passage through a building. It is a passage through time itself. Every step you take is a step that someone else took before you, in a different era, under different circumstances, with different hopes and fears. The probationer nurse, walking her first night shift, terrified she will make a mistake. The young doctor hurrying to a delivery, his bag heavy with instruments he has only just learned to use. The porter wheeling a patient to the operating theatre, trying to make a joke to calm the fear in the patient's eyes. The chaplain making his rounds, a small Bible in his hand, a few words of comfort always ready. The cleaner who arrives at 4 in the morning to mop the floor before the day shift begins, who knows every mark and stain and crack in these boards, who has been doing this work for 40 years and will retire soon, and whose son works in the hospital kitchen. All of them have walked this corridor. All of them have left a trace. Not a visible trace, not something you could photograph or measure, but a trace nonetheless. The corridor remembers them in the way that any old place remembers the people who have passed through it. It remembers them in the quality of its light, in the feel of its brass handles, in the creak of its floorboards, in the faint scent of polish and soap and age and care that hangs in its air. The old hospital corridor does not distinguish between the famous and the unknown, the surgeon and the patient, the matron and the cleaner. It remembers them all equally because they all walked the same boards, they all touched the same brass, they all breathed the same air. And that is perhaps the most important thing to understand about this corridor. It is not a monument. It was not designed to be admired or preserved. It was designed to be used, and it has been used, day after day, night after night, for more than a century. Every inch of it bears the mark of that use. The door handles are worn because they have been turned. The floorboards are hollowed because they have been walked on. The bench is darkened because people have sat on it, waiting and hoping and sometimes grieving. The clock is fast because it has been wound by human hands for 130 years, and human hands are not perfect, and that imperfection is itself a kind of truth. The corridor does not judge. It does not prefer one era over another, one kind of medicine over another, one set of beliefs over another. It has seen the old remedies and the new, the leeches and the antibiotics, the bleeding bowls and the IV drips. It has seen faith and science and the complicated space where the two overlap. It has seen the patients who recovered and the patients who did not, and it has held them all in the same quiet space. So the old hospital corridor is not really a corridor at all. It is a vessel. A vessel that holds the accumulated time of everyone who has walked through it. And when you walk it yourself, in the quiet of the early morning, with the sun just beginning to warm the window at the far end, you are not just walking from one place to another. You are adding your own step to a rhythm that began long before you were born and will continue long after you are gone. The dust settles. The floor cools. The corridor waits. Dawn in the old hospital corridor, and the light comes slowly. Not all at once, but in stages, as if the building itself is waking one floor at a time. First, the windows at the far end begin to pale, a soft milky grey that spreads across the worn floorboards. Then the colour returns to things, the brown lino, the cream walls, the brass handles on the swing doors. And with the light comes sound, the creak of a trolley wheel, the trickle of water being poured from an earthenware jug into a basin, the distant chink of a spoon against a cup. These are the sounds of a 19th century hospital stirring to life, and they have a rhythm all their own. At this hour, the corridor belongs to the night nurses. They move quietly, their cotton aprons rustling, their steps unhurried. A handover is taking place near the chart shelf, a narrow wooden ledge fixed to the wall at waist height, where a row of slate boards hangs from brass hooks. Each slate bears a patient's name, their ward number, and a brief note in chalk. 3 ounces of beef tea taken, slept fitfully until 4. Fever slightly abated. The night nurse traces her finger down the column as she speaks, her voice low enough not to carry. The day nurse listens, nodding, making small marks in a leather-bound pocketbook. There is no rush. There never is at 5 in the morning. The hospital is still gathering itself. Nearby, a linen cart stands against the wall. It is a simple thing, wooden framed, with high sides and iron wheels. filled with folded sheets, rough cotton towels, and flannel gowns that had been washed and boiled and hung to dry in the yard behind the kitchen. The linen smells of soap and sunlight and a faint trace of carbolic. A nurse reaches in and takes a stack of sheets, checking each one for tears before placing them on her arm. Linen was a constant concern in the old hospitals. Every tear meant a repair, every stain a fresh boil, every shortage a scramble. They kept meticulous records, so many yards of calico issued, so many pillowcases lost to the laundry. The cart itself would be wheeled from ward to ward throughout the morning, a slow circuit of care. On the window ledge, a row of water jugs catches the growing light. They are made of stoneware, glazed a pale brown, with wide mouths and thick handles, each one filled fresh at dawn from the pump in the courtyard. Water was medicine in its own right, and it was taken seriously. A patient might receive a pint of cold water every hour during a fever, or a jug of barley water sweetened with licorice, or a small measure of toast water if the stomach was weak. The jugs sit in a neat line, beaded with condensation, waiting to be carried to the bedsides. Beside them, a small tray holds a stack of tin cups, polished until they gleam. The windows themselves are open, just a few inches, letting in the morning air. Fresh air was considered one of the most powerful remedies available, and hospital architects designed accordingly. The windows in these old corridors are tall and narrow, set deep into the thick brick walls with wooden sashes that slide up with a certain resistance. Through them comes the smell of damp grass and wet gravel, and the sound of a horse cart rattling past on the street beyond. The air moves slowly through the corridor, stirring the edge of a curtain, carrying away the close atmosphere of the night. It was Florence Nightingale who insisted that the first duty of a hospital was to do the sick no harm, and that meant ventilation above all else. Stale air, she wrote, was the breeding ground of fever, and she was not wrong. The corridor is not a straight line. It bends halfway along, following the original shape of the building, which began as a parish poorhouse in the previous century. The walls are thick and the floors sloped slightly in places, settling over decades. A chapel bell rings in the distance, a single clear note, calling the hospital to prayer. Some of the nurses pause, bow their heads for a moment, then continue. The bell is part of the rhythm, as steady as the pulse of a sleeping patient. On the wall, between two windows, a blackboard hangs. It is divided into columns: ward, bed, diet, treatment. A student nurse with a piece of chalk updates the board each morning, standing on tiptoe to reach the top row. The diet column is the most varied. Some patients are on milk diet, others on fish diet, a few on what was called full diet, which meant meat, bread, and potatoes, the standard fare. There is no column for diagnosis. In the 19th century, a patient might be admitted for fever, debility, or simply old age. The idea of precise diagnosis was still taking shape, and the hospital's job was as much about shelter and nourishment as it was about cure. A porter appears at the far end of the corridor, pushing a wooden trolley loaded with coal scuttles. The heating system is rudimentary, a series of cast iron grates set into the walls, and every few hours the fires need feeding. The porter moves steadily, stopping at each grate, lifting the lid, checking the embers, adding a few lumps of coal. The sound of the shovel scraping against the metal is oddly soothing, a small domestic ritual repeated hundreds of times a day. Without it, the wards would grow cold, and cold meant pneumonia, and pneumonia meant death. The porter knew this, though he never said so. He simply did his rounds as he had done for 20 years, nodding to the nurses as he passed. The gradual shift from the old charitable wards to organized modern care is visible here, in the details. A thermometer case hangs beside the chart shelf. A new addition, a sign of the emerging science of medicine. The night nurse carries a pocket watch with a second hand, another innovation, counting pulses with increasing precision. A stack of printed forms sits on the matron's desk, replacing the handwritten notes of earlier years. The old hospital corridor is a place in transition, caught between the era of the benevolent visitor and the age of the trained professional. Both approaches shared the same quiet dedication, and both left their mark on the floorboards, worn smooth by generations of footsteps. The light grows stronger now, and the corridor begins to fill with the sounds of the day ahead. The slow, steady machinery of care turning once more. The long, polished floorboards of the old hospital corridor catch the late morning sun at a low angle, each scuff and scratch rendered silver by the light. The night shift has gone home an hour ago, their footsteps finally fading from the stairwell, and a profound quiet has settled into the space between the wainscoting and the high ceiling. There is a particular quality to a hospital corridor at this hour, when the urgency of the night has passed and the full weight of the day has not yet arrived. The air itself seems to hold its breath. The smell of floor polish and boiled linen and something faintly medicinal mingles with the first warm draft coming through the open window at the far end, where the casement is being pushed outward on its iron hinge and a curtain of white muslin lifts and falls with the rhythm of an old man breathing. Sunlight falls in long yellow rectangles across the floorboards, each pane of glass throwing its own perfect geometry onto the worn timber. The light is thick with dust motes, thousands of them, turning and drifting in slow columns, disturbed only by the occasional passage of a porter or a nurse. The dust motes are the only things that move without purpose in this corridor. Everything else moves with the quiet gravity of institutional life. A linen cupboard stands open at the midpoint of the hall, its shelves stacked high with folded sheets, pillowcases, towels, all arranged in precise rows that speak to a system of order that predates the memory of anyone now living. The door of the cupboard is painted the same pale cream as the walls, and its brass handle has been polished so often by so many hands that the metal has worn thin in the middle, a shallow groove. The exact shape of a thumb. The corridor stretches the length of the old infirmary block, 120 feet from the main entrance to the chapel wing. On either side, doors open into wards, each door numbered in black paint on a white enamel plate, the numbers worn at the edges from decades of wiping. The doors are heavy, solid timber framed in oak, with brass handles that catch the light and send small points of brightness dancing across the ceiling when the sun shifts behind a cloud. The doors are never quite closed and never quite open. They stand ajar by a few inches, as though the building itself is listening for something. Through the gaps come the sounds of the wards, the creak of a bed frame, the murmur of a voice too low to make out words, the distant clatter of a metal tray set down on a trolley. A ward clerk sits at a small desk near the center of the corridor, her pen moving steadily across a ledger, the nib scratching in a rhythm that has not changed since she sat down at dawn. She wears a white blouse with the sleeves rolled twice at the cuff, and her hair is pinned back with a kind of thoroughness that suggests she has been doing this work for longer than she cares to remember. Before her on the desk is a stack of admission forms, a bottle of ink, a blotting pad, and a small vase of flowers that someone has brought from the garden. She does not look up when a porter passes. She does not need to. The corridor is her domain, and she knows every sound that belongs to it, and every sound that does not. The porter is a man of perhaps 60, with shoulders that slope from years of carrying, and a face that has settled into an expression of patient weariness. He pushes a trolley loaded with linen bags, the wheels of the trolley rattling softly over the boards, a sound that has become so familiar to the corridor that it has become part of the silence. He moves at the same pace he has moved at for 30 years, neither fast nor slow, the pace of a man who has learned that nothing in a hospital is improved by hurrying. He nods once to the ward clerk as he passes, and she nods back, and the exchange is so small and so ordinary that it would pass unnoticed by anyone who did not understand that this is the true language of the institution. The quiet commerce of recognition between people who spend their lives in the same long hall. Near the window, on a wooden bench painted the same cream as the walls, sit two visitors, an elderly man and a woman who might be his daughter. The man holds a newspaper open on his lap, but he is not reading it. He is looking at the sunlight on the floor, his eyes following the slow drift of the dust motes. The woman sits with her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the door of the ward where someone she loves lies beyond her reach. They have been sitting there since before the sun came up. The bench is hard and the corridor is drafty, but they do not complain. This is what it means to be a visitor in an old hospital. You wait. You sit on the bench and you watch the light move across the floor, and you listen to the sounds of the corridor. And you wait. The cleaning pail stands against the wall near the linen cupboard. A galvanized steel bucket with a mop handle projecting from it at an angle. The mop head is wet, and a small puddle has formed on the floorboards, dark against the pale wood, reflecting a sliver of sky from the window. The pail has been left there by the cleaner who works the night shift, the last of her tasks before she gathered her things and went home. She will return at the same hour tomorrow, and she will fill the same pail with the same warm water, and she will move the same mop across the same boards, and the corridor will be clean again for another day. There is something deeply reassuring about the pail. It speaks to the continuity of the place. The building has been cleaned every morning for 100 years, and it will be cleaned every morning for 100 more. And the sight of the pail against the wainscoting, catching the light, waiting, is a kind of promise. The open window brings in the sound of the chapel bell. It is a single bell, hung in a small turret above the chapel entrance, and it rings only for services and for the dead. But at this hour, with the window open, it is the sound that fills the corridor more than any other. The bell has a deep, soft note, the note of old bronze that has been struck 1,000 times. And when it rings, the sound moves through the corridor like water through a slow river, touching every surface, every closed door, every folded sheet, every pair of folded hands. The bell rings 3 times, then stops. The silence that follows is deeper than the silence that came before. The corridor was not always a corridor. It was once the main hall of a charitable institution, built in a century when the care of the sick was not the work of the state, but the work of the church and the community. In those days, the hall was a single large room where the poor and the afflicted came to receive such comfort as could be offered. There were no wards then, no numbered doors, no linen cupboards, no porters with trolleys. There was only the hall and the fire, and the bench where the sick sat waiting for the physician to arrive on his weekly visit. The physician came on horseback, and his coming was announced by the sound of hooves on the cobbles outside. And the sick would stir from their waiting and turn their faces toward the door. The transformation of the charitable institution into the organized hospital did not happen all at once. It happened room by room, year by year, as the need grew and the understanding of sickness deepened. The corridor was the spine of that transformation. As wards were added, they were arranged along its length, each new wing extending the line of the hall further into the grounds. The floorboards were laid down one after another, each board cut and planed and nailed into place, by men who did not know that their work would outlast them. The walls were plastered and painted the color of cream year after year, the paint building up in layers that a careful eye could still read in the corners where the brush had missed. The windows were enlarged to let in more light, because the physicians had begun to understand that light itself was a kind of medicine, and the sick recovered more quickly in rooms where the sun could reach them. The corridor remembers all of this, not in the way a person remembers, but in the way a building remembers, in the settled grain of its materials, in the worn places where countless hands have touched, in the creak of a particular floorboard at the third door on the left, in the draught that comes under the door of the old pharmacy. The corridor holds the memory of every person who has walked its length. The physician in his black coat, carrying his bag of instruments. The nurse in her starched apron, moving quickly between the wards. The patient who was carried in on a stretcher and walked out on his own feet a month later. The patient who was carried in and did not walk out. The child who came in with a fever and left with a new name for the thing that had nearly taken her. The old man who arrived in a cart and lay in the hall for 3 days before a bed, became free, and who told stories to the other waiting sick in a voice as dry as autumn leaves. The sunlight has moved across the floor, the golden rectangle shortening as the morning advances toward noon. The dust motes continue their slow dance. The linen cupboard door stands open. The visitors on the bench have not moved, though the old man has folded his newspaper and placed it beside him, and his hands now rest on his knees, the fingers loosely curled. The ward clerk has turned a page in her ledger and dipped her pen in the ink. The porter has gone back to the laundry and will return in a few minutes with another load of clean linen, the wheels of his trolley announcing his approach from 100 feet away. There is something about a hospital corridor that cannot be captured in a photograph or a drawing. It is not the shape of the space or the color of the walls or the arrangement of the furniture. It is the quality of the waiting that fills it. Every corridor in every hospital is a place of waiting. The patients wait in their beds for the doctor to come. The visitors wait on the bench for news. The nurses wait for the night shift to end and the day shift to begin. The cleaner waits for the ward to empty so she can mop the floor. The building itself waits for the next patient, the next emergency, the next birth, the next death. The corridor is the place where all these waiting times meet and mingle and become something greater than the sum of their parts. The corridor has seen the changes that have transformed the practice of medicine. It was built in an age when the physician relied on his senses alone, when diagnosis was a matter of looking and listening and touching and asking, when the only instrument was the stethoscope and the only remedy was rest and good food and clean air. It has seen the arrival of electricity, of telephones, of X-ray machines, of antibiotics, of 1,000 inventions that have made medicine more precise and more powerful. And yet the corridor itself has not changed. The same sun falls through the same windows. The same dust rises and settles. The same door swings open and closed. The building adapts and endures, and the corridor remains the quiet heart of the institution. The chapel bell rings again, 3 notes, the same notes as before, and the sound drifts through the open window and down the length of the corridor, touching each door in turn. The ward clerk pauses in her writing and lifts her head, listening. The old man on the bench stirs, his eyes opening. The woman beside him does not move, but something in the set of her shoulders softens. The bell is a reminder that the corridor is not merely a passage between rooms, but a passage between states of being, between sickness and health, between life and death, between the world outside and the world within. The corridor is the place where these boundaries become permeable, where the ordinary rules of time and space seem to give way to something older and more mysterious. The porter returns with his trolley, the wheels sounding their familiar rhythm on the boards. He stops at the linen cupboard and begins to unload the clean sheets, stacking them on the shelves with the same methodical care he has brought to this task for 30 years. He works without hurry, without wasted movement, his hands knowing exactly where each stack belongs. The sheets are warm from the laundry, and they give off a faint smell of starch and steam and the particular scent of cotton that has been boiled and dried in the open air. The porter works in silence, and the corridor absorbs his silence into its own. And for a long moment there is no sound but the rustle of linen and the distant murmur of the city beyond the walls. The morning deepens toward noon. The shadows shorten. The sunlight on the floorboards grows brighter and then begins, almost imperceptibly, to fade as the sun reaches its zenith and begins its long descent toward the afternoon. The visitors on the bench will soon be joined by others, the lunch hour bringing a fresh stream of families and friends and worried loved ones. The porter will make another trip to the laundry and another after that, his trolley tracing the same path it has traced every day for as long as the building has stood. The ward clerk will close her ledger at noon and open a fresh one in the afternoon, and the names in the new book will be different, but the work will be the same. The corridor will fill and empty and fill again, and the hours will pass, and the day will turn into evening, and the evening into night. And the night shift will come, and the day shift will go home, and the corridor will remain. It is this enduring quality that makes the old hospital corridor a place of such profound comfort. In a world of constant change, where every certainty seems to dissolve on contact, the corridor stands as a testament to the value of continuity. The floorboards are worn, but they are sound. The paint is faded, but it is clean. The windows are old, but the light that comes through them is the same light that has always come through them. The building was built to last, and it has lasted, and it will last, and there is a deep and abiding peace in that knowledge. The corridor speaks in a language older than words. It speaks in the grain of the wood, in the patina of the brass, in the way a particular floorboard creaks when you step on it in the dark. It speaks in the quality of the silence after the last visitor is gone and the lights have been dimmed, and the only sound is the soft tick of the radiator and the distant chime of the chapel clock. To walk the length of the old hospital corridor is to walk through time itself, to feel the accumulated weight of all the lives that have passed this way, to sense the presence of all the hands that have touched these walls, all the feet that have worn these boards, all the voices that have echoed through this air. The morning is nearly gone. The corridor is bathed in a soft golden light that will not last much longer. The dust motes are settling now, their dance slowing as the sun begins its retreat from the floor. The linen cupboard has been restocked and the door has been closed. The cleaning pail has been collected by someone from the day staff, taken to the scullery to be emptied and rinsed. The visitors on the bench are preparing to leave, the old man rising slowly, his joints stiff from the long wait, the woman gathering her bag and her coat. The porter has finished his rounds and stands for a moment at the end of the corridor, looking out the window at the chapel yard, his hands resting on the handle of his empty trolley. The ward clerk writes the last entry of the morning, blots the page and closes her pen. And then, in that moment of transition, when the morning has ended and the afternoon has not yet begun, the old hospital corridor is at its most beautiful. The light is low and warm, the air is still. The sounds of the wards are muted, as though the building itself has drawn a breath and is holding it. The corridor is empty, or nearly empty, and for a moment it belongs entirely to itself. It is not a passage between places. It is a place in its own right, a room of surpassing stillness, a long hall of quiet and light and memory. The chapel bell strikes the hour. The notes fall into the corridor like stones into still water, and the ripples spread outward, touching everything. And then the last note fades and the silence returns, deeper than before. The corridor settles into the afternoon. The dust motes begin a new dance in a new angle of light. A nurse pushes open a ward door and steps into the corridor, her footsteps brisk on the boards. The day continues. The old hospital corridor, as it has done for 100 years and more, carries on. And for those who have walked its length, who have sat on its bench, who have waited in its quiet light, the corridor becomes a part of them, a memory of patience and peace that they carry with them long after they have left the building behind. And so we too may leave this corridor, its sunlight fading gently into the dust of afternoon, its silence settling like a blanket over the worn floorboards, its bell still chiming somewhere in the quiet of the mind, a soft and steady pulse that accompanies us as we turn from the window and find our way toward whatever comes next. Behind us, the handle settles back into place. The door breathes once on its hinges, and the corridor returns to its patient work of holding footsteps, whispers, waiting, and light. In the very last hour before dawn, the old corridor changed again. The lamps burned lower, the night nurse moved more slowly, and the whole building seemed to settle into a quieter kind of watchfulness. A clerk might still be bent over a ledger in a side room, finishing the final lines of the night report. A folded sheet might wait on a bench outside the ward, ready for the first bed change of morning. In the laundry, the fires under the boilers had fallen to a dull red, and in the chapel, the last candle had become a pool of wax. Nothing in these moments looked dramatic, and yet the corridor held together all the separate labors that made the hospital possible. It joined the admission desk to the ward to the bathroom to the laundry to the stores, and the stores to the office where every expense and every patient name was written down. It was the artery of an institution that was learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to care for bodies in an ordered way. If we listen closely, we can hear not only footsteps, but the making of modern routine itself. The measured round, the clean sheet, the note in the margin, the tray set down softly before sunrise. The old hospital corridor was never only a passage. It was the place where separate acts of care became a system, and where the system, for all its hardness, sometimes offered the poor a dignity they could not find anywhere else. That is why the corridor remains worth remembering, not because it was grand, but because so much human effort moved through it in silence.